Welcome to the Low Carb MD Podcast. No one is beyond help. No one is beyond hope. Nothing said on the Low Carb MD Podcast is medical advice. Please consult your own doctor before making any lifestyle changes.
Welcome to the Low Carb MD Podcast. This is our continued sort of coverage on the type 1 space. And I am so happy because I have the MVP of the type 1 space of 2024. I have Beth McNally, who's here. And if you've been living under a rock and you haven't seen the IPTN guidelines for type 1, or if you've been living under a rock and you haven't seen the SMHP position statement on type 1, she is the only author who was actually on both of those amazing, amazing documents. A little bit about her. She has a master's in public policy. She has a master's in science and clinical nutrition. And she also has she's been a clinical nutritionist, and I think for a number of years, but I think that when we first met in Boca last year, what took me away was what really left an impression on me was how fiercely she advocated for patients with type 1. And I think, and I hope we can talk about this, I think it came from her lived experience and just seeing, family members suffer with type 1 without help really inspired her to become the amazing leader and evangelist she has become in this space. So I'm just excited to have Beth McNally on, and I am super, super excited to hear sort of how she got here, and how she got to be the, what I would consider the spirit, one of the most valuable people on our team at the SMHP and the IPTN. How does she do so much? What is she drinking? What is she eating? Tell us your secret, because I don't know how it's funny, right before the air, you're like, how do you have so much energy? That's exactly what I think about with you. How do you have so much energy? So Beth, it's nice to have you here.
Oh, thanks, Dro. Thanks for that nice introduction. I think that when you become a mom of a child that has a health condition like type 1 diabetes, and you see other families struggling with this, you need to find your community. And then when you see how many people are struggling, and then you see that the healthcare world isn't where it needs to be so that we can help people, it just seems like an obvious thing to do It's
not an obvious thing to do. It's not an obvious thing to do because the amount of work, first of all, you've had to put up with people like me and to achieve what you've achieved, but you've put in an amazing amount of work, amazing amount of hours. I mean, I have not seen somebody advocate so fiercely for type 1, and it's not a thing to do. You are unique. You are very special, and it's inspiring. It's inspiring to work with you. The passion that you have in this space is inspiring. And, I want every listener, to just know right now, the 50,000 people who listen to this episode, that Beth McNally is my hero. And I think that, Miriam, I know you worked with Miriam for a long time as well. She talks so highly of you, and everything she said was absolutely true and more. So anyway, with all that aside, and all the people that are listening can't see you blush, but maybe where I'd love to start is, you've in the past month, I mean, the crowning achievement, you've put into the ether 2 amazing documents, and this probably was a decade in the making. So maybe we can start briefly about what brought you into this space and what made you interested in this space. I think that's a captivating sort of part of your own story. But then, maybe you can walk people through the evolution of both of these documents and what it took to get them to the finish line, because I don't think the people read these things. There's over 6,000 downloads of the IPTN Type 1 guideline. There's roughly 2,000 downloads of the SMHP position statement. I don't think people realize what it took. So maybe let's start with how you got interested in the space. Obviously your son, but maybe you can give us some clarity around that. And then how did these papers start? Because you were on both teams, and how did you get them to the finish line?
Yeah, sure. Well, it all started on, and I say this, and I know all of the parents and children and people who have ever been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, they'll relate to this. It all started on September 7th, 2015. So everybody remembers Diagnosis Day. And my, at the time, then 9-year-old son, Lachlan, was diagnosed with type 1. And like many people, I'm in the ER, and my head is, my brain is turning over. Type 1 diabetes, what is that? No one in my family has it. I'm not familiar with it. What does this mean for us? So that's sort of where it all began. And we had a wonderful diabetes care team. We live in Canada, and we went to the Ottawa Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario. The diabetes care team was amazing, and they helped us greatly. But we followed the conventional way, and I learned what a carbohydrate was. I remember on day 2 of diabetes education training, I'm like, why does a dietitian keep talking about these carbohydrates? What even is a carbohydrate? And I feel like I eat and breathe carbohydrates nowadays. So that's where we all started, and it was really great. But after 2 months, we changed our whole family's way of eating, because we had heard there wasn't much online back in 2015, but we had watched a YouTube video by Dr. Troy Stapleton in Australia. He was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes as an adult, and he had adopted a low carb way of eating. And he noticed that his blood sugar completely changed. He had much more stable blood sugars. So we decided to try it in our family. And the endocrinology team was amazing. Our endocrinologist was supportive. The dietitian helped us, with meal planning. And at the time, I wasn't on board. It was my husband's idea. And I said, well, look, nothing's working, so I'll give it a try. But how are we going to do this? He's not going to eat like any of his friends. And that was my main concern as a mom at the time. And then we kind of had a start date. And as soon as we sort of changed to a low carb way of eating, the blood sugars changed overnight. And the blood sugar roller coaster was reduced, and things got much easier. And I couldn't believe it. I thought it seemed like magic. When we were looking at the results, it just seemed like, well, how, I really appreciate all the help, but why didn't anyone mention this to us at diagnosis? Like, for 2 months, we've been struggling and stressed, and, he was going low and then he was going high, et cetera. So it's been a very long road. I actually, I'd worked for the federal government in Canada, and I had worked in the international education industry between Canada and Australia for about 15 years. I knew nothing about nutrition. All I knew was try not to feed your children too much sugar. And that's, that was, the limit of my knowledge in the health and nutrition space. And so I decided that even though we had been able to normalize Lachlan's blood sugars, I didn't know how we did it. I did it just based on the food, but I didn't really understand what was happening in the body. So I decided to go back to school, and I got a master's degree in clinical nutrition. And then when I graduated, there was just all this demand in the space. So since 2020, I've worked in a number of areas, in type 2 diabetes, type 1 diabetes, for Miriam Kalamian's Keto for Cancer nutrition team. And Miriam was amazing. And she was another mom, who had a child with a medical condition. And that's how she entered the space. There must be something about us, because when we see our children going through what they're going through, we do everything that we can, to try to help them and then to try to help others.
I want to talk about the lived experience just a little bit before we get into how these documents sort of came to be. The average patient with type 1 will die anywhere from a decade to 4 decades earlier than they should, depending on where they live. The chances of having blindness, kidney disease, a heart attack are 2 to 10-fold higher. And but I think what we don't talk about often is the lived experience.
Yeah.
Like your son has a sugar of 300 because he included the Fruit Loops with the red 40 and then dosed 10 units of insulin to handle that. And now you're fearing hypoglycemic shock at night. I mean, can you talk about what that lived experience is like? Because I don't think, people understand a little bit insulin and blood sugar, they get it, but I don't think they understand that there's intense fear, intense worry, concern over long-term health. I mean, it's so can you give insight into that, as a mom and as a patient advocate?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll look at it from a couple of angles. First of all, from a personal experience, my grandfather was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes in his 50s. And when I was 17 years old, I witnessed him having an amputation. And I remember that clearly. It was very distressful for our family. I even still remember, and I'm sorry, this is hard, but I remember the smell of it. And I remember as a teenager, none of us could understand what was going on. I mean, I was young. My mom was very distressed. My grandmother was very distressed. And so that really stuck with me. So then when my son was diagnosed at the age of 9 with type 1 diabetes, they did mention the long-term complications. And it clicked in really quickly that I needed to save my son from the fate that my grandfather had. And my grandfather had that fate after only 22 years of type 2 diabetes. So if my son was diagnosed at 9, I knew we had a long road ahead of us to make sure that that path and that journey didn't involve diabetic complications. So how do you do that? So immediately my husband was pulling Dr. Google all-nighters to try to figure out, how to do this. And you go to diabetes education when you're first diagnosed, and we need to remember that many children are diagnosed in diabetic ketoacidosis. So for people who don't know what diabetic ketoacidosis is, the children are, very close to losing their life, and some children do lose their life, and they're often hospitalized. And the parents are shocked to begin with at that time because, it presents like a flu, so it's often missed. So when a type 1 diabetes occurs and there's diabetic ketoacidosis, everybody is in shock. And there's the stress factor of your child being in the hospital and almost losing them. And then suddenly you're told your child needs insulin because the body no longer produces insulin in type 1 diabetes. And you need insulin for many things. You need insulin in order to every time you eat. And so you're taught through the diabetes educators that you are going to, every time you give a meal, there are carbohydrates, fats, and proteins in the meal. And you're going to count the carbohydrates in the meal. And we're going to do a little mathematical formula. And we're going to decide how much insulin to give just before your child eats. And then hopefully that insulin medication will be able to deal with the blood glucose rise that occurred from the meal. And ideally, you want to try to match that up. So you leave the hospital when your child is just diagnosed and you go, okay, as long as I do these math problems right, and as long as I count the carbohydrates in the food, I'm going to be able to do this. And it is the wildest thing ever because you're still in shock from the diagnosis. You're kind of in stress mode. You can't think clearly. From day 1, actually for me, it was day 2, I was giving my son injections. I'd never given any of my children an injection, right? So even that is a huge, it's a huge burden. It's, the child obviously doesn't want the injection, but you need to give the insulin injections to keep the child alive. So there's a lot going on.
It's trauma, a lot of trauma.
It's trauma. There are PTSD studies on parents. on fathers, on mothers, and the information on that is wild. And that is when, nothing is going wrong in type 1. That is just the diagnosis of type 1 and having to manage type 1 diabetes as a caregiver every day. So the beginning is very hard because you're trying to figure out what you're doing and you're wanting to make sure that your child is safe. And if you don't know a lot about type 1 diabetes, the biggest challenge in type 1 diabetes is you're trying to keep the blood glucose levels between a certain range. Because if you can keep the blood glucose levels between a certain range, if they don't go too high, you avoid long-term diabetic complications, but you also just avoid your child not feeling well in the moment. And sorry, this is true for adults too, but I tend to talk about children with type 1 diabetes because it's my sort of main focus. And we would also notice, we always knew if Lachlan's blood sugar went high, he'd start picking a fight with his younger brother, or he was moody and he was cranky and he talked often like in this high-pitched voice. So we had these signs of high blood sugar. So you're trying to avoid high blood sugars, particularly because of the long-term complications of diabetes, such as blindness, kidney disease, nerve damage, etc. But you're also trying to avoid what is every parent's greatest fear, and that's a severe hypoglycemic episode. So that is very low blood sugar, because we are taught right from the beginning that is the worst thing that can happen. Because if they go unconscious, they may, fall into a coma. There won't be enough glucose to the brain, and you will lose them. So right away, you're now on this sort of fine. This balancing act between high and low blood sugar. And so it's confusing right from the begining. You're very stressed out. And then you start to understand and you start to get it. And you start to dose your insulin and you feed the foods that you normally feed your child. And you are sort of trying to make sure that works out. But you notice that their blood sugars are constantly going up and down, and you sort of think right away, oh, I didn't think there would be that much fluctuation. And when you have the fluctuation, you have, the child doesn't feel well, they're moody. But then you have all of the other things that affect blood sugar levels. You have exercise. So I have so many parents that I speak with, and they don't let their children with type 1 diabetes exercise because they're terrified, because you can have low blood sugar when you exercise. And so they're very worried, that if they let their child go outside and run around the neighborhood, or if they, bring them to a baseball, to play baseball or swim or whatever the case might be, they might have hypoglycemia. And that's one of their greatest fears. So there are all these things that are really complicated. And then you learn as a parent, well, wait a minute, if I don't have normal blood sugars for my child, they're going to develop, they could go blind. There are huge, like one of my biggest fears was, my son Lachlan is wonderful with children. He's always loved children, and he wants to have a family of his own someday. And there are major issues related to men with type 1 diabetes being able to have children as adults. So I want to be able to make sure that that's a possibility for him, and that there are no issues related to fertility. So you're trying to manage this as a parent, and continuous glucose monitors are what almost all children with type 1 diabetes wear now. And they're wonderful because they help keep our children safe. But all day long, what are the moms and dads doing while they're at work or while they're at home? They're watching their kids' CGMs at school all day, go up and down, and they see their child going low. And it's terrifying because you're constantly texting your child and you're saying, please treat your hypoglycemia. It's really hard to understand when you're not living that life. And then what happens is, when you are that caregiver, your friends and your other family members don't understand that suddenly your whole world has become diabetes management, because this is a 24/7 job. Blood glucose levels don't stop changing, so you have to constantly respond.
It's I think many people don't understand the amount of pressure, whether it's if you have a pediatric type 1, and it's the parents managing it, or if you're, an adolescent or an adult type 1 and you're managing it, the amount of pressure, the amount of burden knowing that you could be putting your kid's life at risk, you could be putting yourself at risk. And you touched on exercise. I feel like this is a huge area. Nobody even knows how to manage exercise in type 1. How do you manage the insulin requirements? I mean, like even the doctors don't know. So I think what I heard with this is basically it's, forget about the fear of medical complications, the immense and you mentioned some of the metabolic and fertility complications, but the immense psychologic burden and lived burden. I think that's not, nobody really appreciates that. And, just even this in itself, like you're thinking like, gosh, will my son be able to have kids? Like, imagine having to worry about that. I mean, you don't have to imagine it. I'm talking to the listener here, like, I don't think that many people can appreciate it. When they see, somebody messaged me after this SMHP statement and said, well, why are you doing this? Right. And, it's like, well, one, why not? Two, the ADA, excuse my language. Sorry, Jack. I know you don't feel that way, so I could say that. But, and three, there's so much suffering. Forget about A1Cs, forget about it for a second. There's just suffering of dealing with like a variable blood sugar. Like that's simple. There's suffering, psychological burden, like physical burden. I mean, it's too much. It's too much.
Yeah. And I think, and we're talking about the stress and we're talking about the lived experience and it is incredibly challenging. And yet in the emergency room, the first thing we did with our son was we looked up all the athletes that have type 1 diabetes because he was like, Mom, am I going to be able to play hockey? Am I going to be able to play soccer? Am I going to be able to swim? And of course, let's see who else does that. Right. And then we have these heroes, with type 1 who are doing all of these amazing things. And you go, great. Okay, we are going to do everything we can to make sure you just have a normal life. So then we get to, well, what helps make diabetes easier to manage? And this is where these papers come into play. And people have various tools that they can now use to manage diabetes. And we have much better technology. We have insulin pumps, we have CGMs, we have more accurate glucometers, et cetera. But at the end of the day, before we had type 1 diabetes, we just used to eat. Nobody can eat anymore with type 1 diabetes without going, how much insulin do I need to cover this food? So the fact that we would have guidelines that would encourage people with type 1 diabetes to just eat like everybody else doesn't make any sense to me. We have to say to ourselves, okay, well, what is happening in the body in type 1 diabetes? And why do we need insulin for that? And is there any way we could put less pressure on the body so that it would be easier for us to get the diabetes outcomes that we want, to have more stable blood sugar so that we can, make the risk of a hypoglycemic or hyperglycemic episode lower? And I'm not saying that everyone is going to want to eat this way, but I sure as heck believe that every person who is diagnosed with type 1 should at least know this is an option. And they can choose for themselves, what foods they choose to eat. And they also need to understand why they would choose these foods. And I'm particularly focused on children because they have type 1 diabetes the longest. They are at the greatest risk of diabetic complications. And it also impacts their cognitive abilities when they're growing, their ability to grow. High blood sugars affect, growth and development. So why wouldn't we try to have those, come into normal range? And the problem is when you eat foods that spike blood glucose levels high, it's hard to manage and have and manage type 1 diabetes safely to avoid low blood sugars. So if you want to be able to reduce the blood sugar roller coaster, you have to ensure that you eat foods that don't rapidly spike blood glucose levels immediately after eating. And I think carbohydrates get a bad rap, right? Because not all carbohydrates spike blood glucose levels.
Yeah, certainly green leafy vegetables are a little bit more, stable than, say, a potato or a carrot or, a starchy vegetable. So I want to step back to something you said, and I don't mean to jump around too much, but you mentioned your husband. So your kid's diagnosed, you're going through this. And then your husband had to go and do all-nighters on YouTube. And you are looking at Stapleton's, Dr. Stapleton's lectures, and here it is, 2015, and you have to guide your kids' care on YouTube, right? And I know at the time, Adele was still with us, and she was very active in the space, 2016, 17, 18. We're starting to get this metabolic group together. 2019, we start the SMHP. And I know, Adele's dream was to have guidelines and consensus statements. Mm-hmm. And I had an awesome chance to work with her before her untimely passing. Mm-hmm. So here you are in 2015 having to go to YouTube. And as the years go by, you see this, sort of band of people coalesce, the IPTN up in Canada. And there's some other groups, great groups up in Canada, and here, Low Carb USA and the SMHP, and of course the Nutrition Coalition here in the United States. So can you describe a little bit about those formative years of what eventually led to be the two of the most important documents in type 1, in my opinion, right now? So can you walk us through that?
Yeah. So, and I'll take it. Our first clue was the Dr. Troy Stapleton video. Thankfully, my husband stumbled on it. And then Dr. Troy Stapleton mentioned Dr. Richard Bernstein's book, The Diabetes Solution. So we ordered that book, and that was very helpful. It felt like a dense read, so we couldn't understand everything in those early days. But that was also, it's a type 1 diabetes Bible, and how it hasn't been more widely accepted all these years later just baffles me. So we had Dr. Bernstein's book, and then a few months after we went low carb, we found out about the Facebook group Type 1 Grit. And for the first time, I think it was maybe February 2016, and I remember just being floored that other people were doing this with their children and they were okay. Because my biggest fear was my child wouldn't grow, because everyone told me he wouldn't. So I was very worried about that. And it was just such a relief to find the Type 1 Grit group. So then we get Type 1 Grit, and then in 2017, I went to the first ever Low Carb USA conference, and that was the month before I started my degree. And there were all of these people, and in those days, it was in its infancy, but there was a lot of excitement that people were getting better across all of these different medical conditions just by, focusing on, not just by focusing on nutrition, but nutrition was a key element. And then I did my degree, and when I came out, by that time there was we owe a much gratitude to Bethany Reynolds and Lester Hightower and other people who formed Let Me Be 83. R.D. Dykman also working with them, and Allison Hershidi from Type 1 Grit. And we could get the word out a lot more in the Type 1 community. So in my world, personally, there were two trains of kind of colliding. One was this kind of general metabolic health side, and then the other was the Type 1 diabetes community. And I then heard Adele Heights through, because Doug and Pam at Low Carb USA have their, video conferencing option. So I saw Adele Heights speak about the new clinical guidelines. And I had just graduated when the SMHP original low carb guidelines came out. And it was a blessing to me because when I worked with clients, I had something to guide me in how to work with them. There was nothing else like it at the time, where I was mainly working with people with type 2 diabetes. And so I was very grateful. So she was doing a presentation on that. And at the very end of the presentation, she said, we are going to do condition-specific guidelines, and we are going to start with type 1 diabetes. And my jaw dropped to the floor because I thought, oh, type 1 diabetes, wow, that's a tough one. I can't believe she's willing to go there. So I emailed her and I said, I've just graduated, but I would love a seat at the table if there is a table. And there already had been a table assembled. IPTN had been assigned the lead organization, helping to facilitate all of the participants on that table. And then Adele asked me to take it over. And that guidelines committee, the dietetics group, along with Dr. Caroline Roberts and Andrew Kutnick, and my dietetics colleagues, Amy Rush and Franziska Spritzler, who are just unbelievable at what they do. We all got together and we continued the work. And after about 2 years of work, these are all volunteers. I mean, trying to get people together when they're as busy as they are was, to say it was a challenge. It's funny. Sometimes I can't actually believe that we got to where we are. But we produced the IPTN, Institute for Personalized Therapeutic Nutrition Canada, published it in November on World Diabetes Day, Therapeutic Carbohydrate Reduction in Type 1 Diabetes, a guide for dietitians and nutritionists. And the reason we started with dietitians and nutritionists is because we kept hearing from them that they didn't know how to help people, implement low carb nutrition, particularly in type 1 diabetes, because people are scared of type 1 diabetes because insulin medication is involved. So, fortunately, Dr. Caroline Roberts, who's an endocrinologist, agreed to come on board. And along with Amy Rush, who's a CDE, they wrote the insulin section so that we could make sure that we would have healthcare practitioners having a starting point about what to think about when they're titrating insulin when somebody reduces their carbohydrate intake. And I hope that that's helpful. It's a starting point. I mean, it's only been 3 weeks, Tro, and we've heard from people in Spain, Norway, Italy, and Portugal asking for translations of the document. We are currently translating it into French because IPTN, we're up here in Canada. We have 2 official languages, English and French. So the French translation will be out soon. And so it's just very exciting to have something. And we wanted it free. We wanted it free so that I hear from parents all the time. I went to my endocrinologist, I went to my diabetes care team, I went to my dietitian, and they don't know how to help me. And plus, they don't have guidelines that allow them to tell people about this. And that's where the SMHP paper comes in to encourage the clinical guidelines to be changed.
So when was the date that Adele, what was that date? I'm just curious, just to give an idea of a listener, like the year, give me a year, just to...
I think it was it was definitely before the pandemic. So that would have been early 2020.
Yeah, 2020 or 2019.
And I have to be honest, we met a lot as a clinical guidelines group, and it was very difficult to come to consensus around what to do with insulin. So we decided to take the dietetics nutrition piece out and start there.
Yeah, I think one of the things we found similarly, well, first, applause to you and everybody at IPTN. What an amazing group and what an amazing document. It's going to be amazing. It is amazing already. I think you said over 6,000 downloads, which is awesome. And it's only going to go up. Interestingly, I think maybe 2 years in, Adele helped us with when I say us, I mean the SMHP with our, initial consensus statement, our position statement on therapeutic carbohydrate reduction. And one of the first things that we wanted to do at SMHP was secure a journal. And, we did this a couple of years back with the Journal of Metabolic Health. And then 2, we wanted to start publishing position statements, developing consensuses, and, I don't want to say weaponizing the literature. I don't think that's the right way, but at least bringing balance to the medical literature. So now gosh, let's just say, a type 1 patient goes to a dietitian who says you cannot do low carb, and that kid has wild fluctuations and goes into hypoglycemic shock into the emergency room. And when that mother or father finds out that there is a statement saying that, hey, therapeutic carbohydrate reduction is an option to stabilize blood sugar, well, now they can take that document and say, well, why didn't you tell me this? Why didn't you say this? So I don't think people understand that now that it's in the literature, not to say it's weaponizing the medical literature isn't the right word, but maybe it is the right word. It's now there. And this went, there are patient advocates, scientists, doctors who came together and said, this is a viable approach and it shouldn't be biased against. So that document.
And I think I would love for healthcare practitioners, we need to depend on each other. I think people don't understand. We have these, coming at it as a mom, it was so ridiculous to me when I went and did my nutrition degree. I'm like, oh my goodness, we have all these scientific terms for everything, and it makes a lot more sense as a parent, even the child. There's the famous story of, David Dykman saying to his endocrinologist at diagnosis, well, I'll just take out the carbs, and everyone laughed at him. And he was 9 years old and smarter than all of us, and I think to myself, when you're a mother, it makes more, or a father or a child, it just makes more common sense. It's just food on a plate. It's just chicken and broccoli and all. People are like, well, kids are never going to eat this way. And I'm like, well, here's where the dietitians and nutritionists can play a role. Because what I see is within 3 to 4 weeks, the children's taste buds are changing. Our food environment does not help the world of solid nutrition. So kids if you think your child is never going to eat that, we have lots of data that say that our body adjusts to what we feed it. And parents have a really big challenge because they can feed their child one way, but as soon as they let them out of the house, you actually really have to take a strong stance in what your child is going to eat outside the house if you want to maintain normal blood glucose levels. So how do you do that? So you have to send food with your child. You have to have different strategies. But when you understand how your child's blood sugar changes, and what people don't understand is there's so much less stress that not everybody's on edge. Imagine having a parent and you're a child with type 1 and you can see that your parents are on edge all day long, and that whatever happens to your blood sugars changes their mood. And that if you could change that by having more stable blood glucose levels because you change the food, some people say pick your hard. If you can create eating habits, it's the parent's job to decide what the child eats. It's the child's job to decide how much they'd like to eat. And there's so many ways that we can help healthcare practitioners help parents to be able to do this. And I encourage people to call me, and don't be scared to go, I don't know how to do this. This seems overwhelming. This seems not right. I'm worried about people still think kids need carbs to grow. As long as they have enough protein and fat, they don't. We still feed them great carbs. We just are selective in which carbohydrate foods we give them. And hopefully the whole world will start shifting back to this more healthy way of eating, which will help type 1 diabetes and all of us. Like when we my husband's mother lives in Europe. When we go there, we don't even have to eat low carb. We can just eat. The food is different there. In North America, it's just another world.
I think that, I want to come back. Like every single type 1 patient, every single type 1 kid serves a life that normally would see a period of time off that blood sugar roller coaster. And there's some amazing things that are in the pipeline. We have antibodies now that may delay the onset. We have closed loop systems that are becoming a little bit more aggressive that just take some of the burden out. but the simple things that a 9-year-old kid, can tell a endocrinologist, I think is, that gives people agency, that gives families agency, that gives the patient agency. And I think, that's, that's something that the industry can't profit off of. We cannot profit. There's no way to profit off of increased agency. The industry can run trials for a closed loop system or an antibody, right? And because they can sell you a product, right? But we can't monetize families being empowered and being in charge of their care and not needing sort of, not needing, a reliance or to accept bad outcomes. Mm-hmm. So I think the two things that these documents that were done completely without funding, by the way. So if you are out there, and you see the SMHP document, or if you see the IPTN document, realize that these are not for profits, that with people who are volunteering time. And gosh, we need your help. We need your help to keep doing things like this. So I'm, one of the things I'm curious about is, you've seen both sides of this, the IPTN side and the SMHP side. Where do you think documents how do you think things will change? I mean, clearly there's been some widespread acknowledgement, thousands of downloads, coverage on social media. We're at the SMHP, we're talking to some magazines and different outlets right now. What do you think will change from these two documents? What do you think will happen next?
That's a good question. I've always been part of this sort of, I came to this, through our own family's experience. I've always been part of the sort of, everything sort of started organically from the patient perspective. And I think one of the key things that needs to happen in order to drive this is for patients to take documents like this to their healthcare providers and start having the word out. I mean, even the 5 co-authors on the TCR and T1D guide, I mean, we are already starting to apply to speak at ADA and ADCES events to try to get the word out. We've also been, one of the things I admired about Adele Height is her use of language. And we've really tried to make the guide read as, a friendly, caring, intellectual document where people could feel like they could learn. Because I've talked to endocrinologists that say, I can't tell people about this. I have no guideline that allows me to do this. But if somebody comes to me and says, I want to do this, then I can help them. It's a backwards way that we're doing things. I mean, our family is moving to Australia in January. I'm excited for what the Australasian Metabolic Health Society and all the stuff that Low Carb Down Under. I'm really interested to see what they're doing. But there are now international organizations like SMHP, like IPTN, like the Australasian Metabolic Health Society, like the Nutrition Network. We're all making connections and we're all finding the people. So what does that mean? I don't know. I really hope that the American Diabetes and Canadian Diabetes Associations will listen. I know that IPTN presented our guide at the Canadian Diabetes annual conference a couple of weeks ago in Halifax. And, they said things were very well received. I don't know. I wish I could answer your question, Charles. I don't know. I just know that when you're a parent or an individual that's diagnosed, and keep in mind, this is going to be continue to be a growing problem in type 1. 9.4 million people as of this year in the world have type 1. And by 2040, that's supposed to be 16.4. So you're going to see many more people with diabetes knocking on your door if you're a healthcare professional. So you need to understand how to help them. And we know that GPs, PCPs, they're frustrated because they don't know how to help people with type 1.
I remember 10 years ago when I had my first so I had type 1 patients in the conventional medical realm, but when I started focusing on nutrition and therapeutic carbohydrate reduction as a modality, I had my first patient with type 1. Type 2 is easy, just like stop the insulin, give them a CGM. And I remember, I don't know who it was, who did I call up? Maybe it wasn't 8 years ago. I called up Ted Naiman. I called up Jason Funk. I just cold called them, or I messaged them on social media. I'm like, guys, I have a type 1 patient who wants to do this. She has weight to lose. She wants to, that was because there was nothing. There was nothing in the literature. And I'm literally just calling different docs. I call up Eric Westman, Mark Cucuzzella, cold called Mark Cucuzzella. Who's this? I'm like, you don't know me. I'm a doctor. I think you're a rock star, So that was the resources available to me. I couldn't go to the ADA. There was nothing, I remember, so that was what I had available to me. And here we are, maybe 8 years later or 10 years later, and these documents are out. And one, I'm proud to work with somebody like you and Andrew Kutnick and Mark and Eric and everybody that's sort of on the SMHP team, everybody that's involved, Ian Lake, Evelyn Baudouin-Roy, the Dykmans, just everybody, and standing on the shoulders of giants like Bernstein and so many others. But then there's the other part of me, and I want to be careful because I know you said, I remember Adele talking to me before she passed. She said, Tro, we have to communicate very carefully, but excuse me, the ADA, right now in 2019, they published a paper, right? They published a paper in pediatrics showing that kids can have a normal A1C. Type 1 kids can have a normal A1C. It was so powerful. It was 3 standard deviations from the current standard of care. The current approach, we as a profession, the ADA, when I see the AMA, every doctor out there, when they see this, how do they not get embarrassed? How do they not say wait a second, a bunch of kids just did better than we've ever done? Maybe we're not as great as we think. Maybe we should stop taking pharmaceutical money and big potato money and Dannon money and Novo Nordisk money, and maybe we should start giving a crap, right? And I'm sorry, I know you said your fear was that I'm a bull in a china shop, which I am clearly, because look at what I just said. But I'm mad. I'm mad that you and I had to do these things. I'm mad. I'm angry. I am, so that's not a bull in a china shop. Maybe I'm just pissed off. I'm full of rage. Why do you and I have to do what we did? Sorry if that's a loaded question. You don't have to answer it.
No, I think I appreciate your perspective. I do think we need people like you.
No, like you. Why
but
do we need people like you and me?
I used to be angry, and I understand that people are angry. When you find out something exists and you weren't told, and your child went through a few months of oh, that didn't need to happen. You go, what? I was angry for a few years. And for some reason, I don't know why, I'm like, look, they are what they are. Maybe the reason that I'm not as angry is in type 1 diabetes, it's different. The person who has it is self-managing. They are in control of their own destiny. And they already, people are worried about restrictive diets. Right away, it causes disordered eating. You're counting everything. You're dosing insulin. There's all this weird stuff that happens as soon as a diagnosis happens. But the people with type 1 diabetes get to know their bodies well. They get to know what works and what doesn't, and they have to take the power into their own hands. So if the ADA doesn't give you good advice, don't listen. Find somebody who's figured out how to do it, pay attention and ask them for help. And this is, I guess, why, yes, to be honest, I lost a lot of sleep writing these papers. Yes, I agree with you. I would have rather spent that time with my kids. And am I glad that they're out there so that I can, not do this on my
You should be
first
so
time?
proud, by the way. You should be so proud.
But I also want people with type 1 to just take it into their own hands. You can have normal blood sugars, but you know what? You actually need to figure out how to get there safely. And food is one way that can help you do that. So,
Beth, I'm gonna push back on you because, you know what? We have fire departments, we have police departments, okay, and we have hospitals and medical professions and doctors. If you and I here were saying, well, if they're doing a bad job, just get your own fire extinguisher and put out your own fires, right? Like that's what we're saying. Oh yes, if buy your own guns and defend yourself, and
I agree with what you're saying. I totally understand where you're coming from. I guess all I'm saying is I don't think these people are going to change. I don't know how to make them change. So let's write some documents so the everyday person can be helped. That's, I guess, where I felt my role could come into play.
And that role was amazing, by the way.
Yeah, and I don't disagree. We need people like you to put a fire under people. And I know that people like Adele and I say, I'm not sure the bull in the China shop approach always works, but I don't have the answer as to what does work.
Yeah, it's a shame. And I got to be honest with you. I wish that every doctor that listens to this just reflects on this for a second. Imagine, a fire, the fire department got there an hour or two late consistently. We would not accept it. Imagine we were having flights, airplanes just dropping out of the sky at rates that were unacceptable, right? This is what's going on right now in the field of diabetes and obesity and metabolic health, both type 1 and type 2. And I think, not to say that, it's unacceptable. And I'm so happy for people like you who have lost sleep. And it's unfortunate that we have. But now, the literature has a document that says we deserve better. And you've given them another document from IPTN showing them exactly how to do better. And I'm just so thankful for you as a person. I'm thankful for every single person you mentioned that's advocated for this, advocated for people with type 1 and all the groups that you mentioned. And, I'm happy that I'm not happy that you had time away from the kids, but I'm happy to have met you and worked with you. And I'll give you the last word.
No, thanks, Tro.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate the leadership you took on this. For all the times that Adele might have said, or I might say about the bull in the China shop, we could not have written this paper. The amount of work, Tro, that you did look at how many authors are on the paper. To get people assembled and coordinated is a huge undertaking. And I have a email folder just with all of the emails that have come with you coordinating everything. And it's a really full folder. So we could not have done this without you. And I know I talked to you in Boca Raton in January and said, please, 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 we need this type 1 diabetes paper published. And we need it, we need it to make sure that it's advocating for people with type 1 in the way that we need it to. And the one line in that paper that gets me every time, which fully aligns with your bull in the China shop approach, is we must not settle for the status quo in type 1 diabetes management.
It's a crime.
So hopefully
it's a crime.
Hopefully we will make progress. I think you can hear a change. My families that I'm working with, when I first started doing this, nobody would support them. Now about 50% of people are being supported. And some doctors are saying, I would like to help you, but I don't exactly know how. To me, that's a step.
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
open-minded.
And amen for people like you. Type 1D, is it T1D or type? It's type 1D Nutrition.com.
T1D, yeah.
T1D Nutrition.com. Thank you for what you do. We've sent our patients your way. And we're just thankful to have you as a resource to people out there. And for all the work that you've done. Just thank you. I can't say it enough.
Thank you. And a big thank you to Low Carb USA and SMHP for hosting the type 1 diabetes workshops at Boca Raton in January. This all came from this. I mean, I'm connected to practitioners all over the world now, thanks to that one event. And we all talk about Boca Raton being a turning point in how we can get coordinated to improve type 1 diabetes management. So a big thank you to Pam and Doug and all of the organizers at SMHP.
Guys, we'll put in the show notes the document to IPTN, and we will have the SMHP statement there. If you're listening, we appreciate your support here at Low Carb MD, and we are commercial free, not for profit, and the SMHP and IPTN are not for profit. So we appreciate your support.
If you enjoy the show, please consider supporting us on Patreon by going to lowcarbmd.com